Pacific War, 1942 to 1945. The thick jungles of the Pacific Islands created a battlefield unlike any other. Fighting often took place at less than 30 yards, where visibility was limited, and reaction time meant survival. In this environment, the United States Marine Corps introduced a weapon that caught Japanese forces completely off guard: the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. The Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 became part of Marine units across the Pacific Campaign. Although combat records rarely detail their use, their very presence represented a capability the Japanese had never prepared for. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent decades studying Western weapons: British rifles, American machine guns, French mortars, Soviet submachine guns. Yet shotguns never entered their doctrine. They dismissed them as bird hunting tools, not combat arms. That assumption would prove dangerous once American forces brought roughly 25,000 Model 97s and 60,000 to 80,000 Model 12s into wartime service. Japanese strategy in 1942 leaned heavily on the belief that spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage. This was more than propaganda. It was a deliberate response to Japan's weak industrial base. In a single month, the United States produced more steel than Japan did in an entire year. The Imperial Army's solution was to train soldiers for superiority in close combat, relying on spirit, endurance, and discipline rather than sheer firepower. Their doctrine emphasized night infiltration attacks, followed by hand-to-hand fighting with rifles and bayonets. These tactics had worked against Chinese troops and even against British forces in Malaya and American defenders in the Philippines. The approach was straightforward: move silently at night, slip through enemy lines, then strike hard at close range. But at the very distance where Japanese forces expected to dominate, American shotguns erased their advantage. A Marine armed with a Winchester Model 97 could unleash 6 shells of .00 buckshot in just about 2 seconds using the weapon's slam fire feature. Each shell carried 9 pellets of .33 caliber, creating a spread that made misses nearly impossible in thick jungle brush. The Winchester Model 1897, created by John Browning and refined through decades of production, was the Marines' primary shotgun early in the campaign. It came with a 20-inch barrel, a heat shield with perforations, and a bayonet mount that fit the M1917 sword bayonet. Crucially, it lacked a trigger disconnector, allowing slam fire, holding the trigger while cycling the action for continuous shots. The later Model 1912, designed by Winchester engineer T.C. Johnson, improved on this design with an internal hammer that reduced accidental discharges. By 1943, the Model 12 began replacing the Model 97 in many Marine units. Though both models saw combat until the end of the war, the ammunition itself was just as critical. Standard .000 buckshot carried 9 pellets, each weighing 53, 88 grains and measuring 38 mm in diameter. At 10 yards, the spread measured about 10 inches. At 20 yards, 20 inches. At 30 yards, 30 inches. In the jungle, where sightlines rarely exceeded 30 yards, this pattern gave Marines a major edge when aiming was nearly impossible. The Guadalcanal campaign, from August 1942 to February 1943, marked the first major U.S. offensive in the Pacific. Marines of the 1st Division brought various weapons with them, including shotguns, though records don't specify how many. On August 21, 1942, during the Battle of the Tanaru River, commonly called Alligator Creek, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 917 men in an attack. Nearly 789 were killed. Historical sources credit machine guns like the Browning M1917 and 37mm anti-tank guns with canister rounds as the main cause of Japanese losses, though shotguns were mentioned in secondary roles. During Guadalcanal, Marines mostly used shotguns for perimeter defense and jungle patrols. Photos show point men carrying them during patrols, ready for sudden ambushes in heavy vegetation. Yet official after-action reports highlighted rifles, machine guns, and artillery as the dominant battle-winning weapons. Shotguns faced major problems of their own: the tropical humidity. Standard paper-hulled shells absorbed moisture, swelling until they wouldn't chamber properly. Marines reported shells so swollen they had to be hammered into the chamber, which was impossible during combat. This problem persisted through much of the war until brass-cased shells were adopted. On March 29, 1945, the U.S. military officially introduced the all-brass M19 shell, labeled Shell Shotgun Brass 12-gauge No. 00 Buck, M19. These new shells finally solved the moisture issue, restoring reliability, but their late arrival meant most veterans never associated shotguns with decisive combat effectiveness. Training with shotguns was formalized through Technical Manual TM 9285, issued on September 21, 1942. It covered the Winchester Models 97 and 12, Remington Model 11, Stevens Models 520 and 620, and the Ithaca Model 37. Marines trained at Camp Pendleton in California, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and Parris Island in South Carolina. Training focused on point security during patrols, rapid defense at night, clearing caves and bunkers and guarding prisoners. Recruits practiced the slam fire method of the Model 97, though they were warned not to rely on it too much because of the high ammo use and overheating barrel. By 1943, the Marine Corps Table of Organization E100 authorized 306 shotguns for each Marine division. They were distributed to military police units, pioneer battalions, and selected rifle squads for specialized roles. This meant shotguns appeared in every major Marine campaign, but they made up less than 2% of the division's small arms. The historical record shows the shotgun's presence was consistent, but its impact muted. It was a powerful tool for close-quarters combat, but supply issues, ammunition failures, and the dominance of rifles, machine guns, and artillery kept it in the background of Pacific War history. Japan never raised official diplomatic protests over American shotgun use in World War II. This stands in contrast to Germany's formal complaint in September 1918 during World War I, when German authorities declared shotguns violated the Hague Convention. Germany went as far as threatening to execute captured Americans found carrying them, claiming the weapon caused unnecessary suffering. By comparison, captured Japanese documents from during and after the Pacific War make no mention of shotguns requiring any special countermeasures. Japanese training materials focused instead on countering American firepower in general, machine guns, artillery, and flamethrowers, but ignored shotguns completely. This absence indicates that, while Japanese troops certainly faced shotgun fire on occasion, the weapon never had enough battlefield impact to draw official attention. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers further confirm this. They spoke in detail about American advantages in firepower, logistics, and combined arms tactics, but none singled out the shotgun as a particular problem. By contrast, flamethrowers were frequently mentioned and studied, with Japanese forces developing specific defensive tactics against them. In New Guinea from 1942 to 1945, U.S. Army units experienced firsthand the severe limits of shotguns in jungle warfare. The 32nd and 41st Infantry Divisions requested them after hearing of Marine use on Guadalcanal. On paper, the thick jungles of New Guinea, where visibility often dropped to just a few yards, seemed perfect for shotguns. In practice, however, the same issues that plagued Marines at Guadalcanal became worse. Constant rain, river crossings, and unrelenting humidity ruined paper-hulled shells, making them swell and jam. Many units that asked for shotguns ended up leaving them behind, depending instead on M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles. The lesson from New Guinea was clear. Weapons that worked well in training could fail in combat if conditions made them unreliable. The problem would remain unresolved until the arrival of brass-cased shells in 1945. As the war continued, the Marine Corps developed clearer roles for shotguns in combat. They were especially valued in three areas: leading patrols, defending perimeters against infiltration, and guarding prisoners. On patrol, scouts at the front carried shotguns to deal with ambushes. The spread of buckshot allowed them to hit multiple threats at once, buying time for the rest of the unit to deploy. This tactic required strong coordination, since the shotgunner often operated ahead of supporting fire. For night defense, Marines placed shotgun-armed guards at points most vulnerable to infiltration. In darkness, the weapon's wide pattern compensated for poor visibility. The sound of a pump shotgun being cycled even carried a psychological impact, serving as a warning to attackers. But the limited magazine size meant riflemen had to quickly back up the shotgunner once fighting began. The Army also used shotguns in the Philippines during the retaking of Manila in October 1944. The 6th Army requested large numbers for urban combat. The 37th Infantry Division, which did most of the city fighting, used them in house-to-house battles. Shotguns proved effective in sudden, close encounters and room clearing. Yet after-action reports gave greater credit to flamethrowers and demolition charges for breaking Japanese strongholds. Japanese defenders quickly learned to barricade themselves in fortified positions that made it difficult for attackers to close in, limiting shotgun effectiveness. The February 1945 Battle of Iwo Jima placed 3 Marine divisions in combat, with an authorized total of 918 shotguns. However, the island's volcanic ash, fortified caves, and tunnel networks gave little opportunity for their use. Famous events like the flag raising on Mount Suribachi followed assaults where flamethrowers and demolition charges, not shotguns, cleared the defenses. Records from Iwo Jima show no combat results directly tied to shotgun use. On top of this, the brass M19 shells did not reach units until late March, after the battle had ended, meaning Marines still fought with unreliable paper ammunition during one of the Pacific's bloodiest battles. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 marked the first major campaign where brass shells were widely available. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions were authorized 612 shotguns, but the terrain and Japanese defensive strategy again limited their role. Unlike earlier Banzai charges, the Japanese 32nd Army used a defense-in-depth approach, holding strong positions in the Shuri Line. Open ground and fortified bunkers kept American infantry fighting at longer ranges. Tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers carried the burden of assaults. Shotguns appeared mainly during the final clearing of captured bunkers or in military police roles handling civilians, but these were small contributions compared to the broader battle effort. Despite the scale of World War II, detailed accounts of shotgun combat are rare. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project holds thousands of Pacific War interviews, yet shotgun mentions are scarce. The National Museum of the Pacific War holds over 4,000 oral histories, but shotgun stories are almost absent. 2 of the most famous memoirs, Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed and Robert Leckie's Helmet for My Pillow, make no mention of shotguns at all, even though both authors fought in Marine rifle companies. This silence suggests that shotguns played only supporting roles. The few references available describe them as useful in limited situations, night security, jungle ambushes, or patrol point duties, but never as decisive weapons. Veterans remembered rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery as the tools that shaped the outcomes of battles. Official records confirm this picture. Shotguns accounted for less than 2% of a Marine division's small arms. Even though American industry built large numbers of military shotguns during World War II, their actual role in combat remained minor. They were practical in certain close-range situations, but never central to the war's outcome in the Pacific. Winchester produced around 25,000 Model 97 shotguns and between 60,000 to 80,000 Model 12s under military contracts during World War II. Other companies such as Remington, Stevens, and Ithaca added several thousand more. This output highlighted America's unmatched industrial power, but high production numbers did not mean these weapons always saw frontline combat. Many shotguns ended up in supporting roles, used in training centers, guarding supply depots, or patrolling airfields and bases rather than being carried in combat zones. Military police relied on them for prisoner handling and convoy protection. The Navy issued them aboard ships for boarding actions and security. Airfields placed shotguns in perimeter defenses. These assignments consumed a large share of the supply. The difference between how many were produced and how few appear in combat records shows that, although America could have armed every Marine squad with shotguns, practical problems, ammunition issues, tactical limits, and command preferences kept most in secondary roles. The shotgun became a specialized weapon, not a primary battlefield tool. Looking at other weapons helps explain this. The M2 flamethrower, first fielded in 1943, appears in nearly every account of cave or bunker assaults. At Iwo Jima alone, Marines used about 27,000 gallons of fuel, with reports carefully tracking its effectiveness. By comparison, there are no similar records for shotgun ammunition use. The Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, became the foundation of Marine squad firepower, with 3 BAR teams per squad by 1944. Training manuals and combat reports describe BAR tactics in detail. Shotguns, though technically authorized, never earned the same attention in doctrine or records. Even the relatively uncommon M1918 Browning machine gun left behind more battlefield accounts than shotguns. Veterans recalled its firepower, ammo use, and tactical value. The absence of similar detail for shotguns points to their limited battlefield role, despite the large production numbers. The gap between how people remember shotguns and their actual use reflects a broader pattern in World War II history. Popular culture, especially movies, has often exaggerated their importance. On screen, Marines stormed Japanese positions with shotguns in hand, creating lasting images that stuck with the public. Later, video games and popular books reinforced this view, turning shotguns into a supposed symbol of Pacific combat. But the historical record tells a different story. They were there, sometimes useful but rarely decisive. The myth endured because the weapon looked and sounded dramatic, fitting well into stories of brutal close combat. But this did not match day-to-day battlefield reality. The real experiences of Marines back this up. Some veterans spoke about carrying them, but admitted they weren't ideal for all-around fighting. One Marine interviewed in 1985 remembered carrying a Model 97 on Guadalcanal. He said it worked well for night watches and jungle trails but failed when fighting opened up at distance. Then you wanted a rifle. Another veteran from the 2nd Marine Division recalled that each squad was technically issued a shotgun, but often it stayed with company gear instead of going on patrol. Rifles simply offered more flexibility. These accounts reflect the weapon's value in specific jobs but also its limits in broader combat. The introduction of brass-cased M19 ammunition in March 1945 finally fixed the reliability problems that plagued shotguns in humid Pacific conditions. Before then, paper-hulled shells often swelled and jammed, making the weapon unreliable. By the time brass shells appeared, however, Iwo Jima had already been secured and the Okinawa invasion was about to begin. The Philippines campaign was nearly over. The brass shells helped during occupation duties and were intended for the planned invasion of Japan, where they might have been highly effective in urban combat. But the atomic bomb ended the war before that invasion, leaving the brass shell's battlefield value largely untested. Analysts later argued that shotguns would have performed far better had brass shells been available earlier, but this remains speculation. The lack of Japanese countermeasures also reveals their limited battlefield role. Japanese forces built defenses specifically against weapons that caused them major problems. They developed overhead cover to withstand mortars, spider holes to stop tanks, and reverse slope defenses to shield against naval artillery. But they never designed specific measures against shotguns. Their evolving tactics focused on terrain use, fortified tunnel systems, and abandoning massed banzai charges. Shotguns never appeared in their tactical manuals or post-war studies, while artillery, naval bombardment, and tank infantry coordination received extensive attention. This silence confirms the weapon's minor impact. One of the most striking details is the complete absence of hard statistics. World War II generated massive amounts of data: rounds fired, casualties per weapon, hit probabilities, and more. Operational research groups tracked artillery, mortars, rifles, and machine guns with precision. No comparable studies exist for shotguns. Not even rough estimates appear in reports or interviews. Veterans often remembered how many rifle rounds they fired or how many grenades they threw, but similar figures for shotgun use almost never appear. Taken together, the evidence shows that while shotguns were widely produced and officially issued, their actual combat role was small. They were practical for guarding prisoners, leading patrols, or night defense, but never became the backbone of Marine or Army infantry tactics. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery, and flamethrowers shaped the outcomes of Pacific battles. Shotguns filled narrow roles, but the legend built around them grew larger than the reality. Shotguns technically existed in Marine units, but the lack of detailed statistics shows they were not central to frontline combat. Marines went through heavy shotgun training in stateside camps, where they learned slam-fire methods, practiced shooting in jungle-style ranges, and trained with both buckshot and slugs. All of this gave the impression that shotguns would be widely used in battle. But the reality in the Pacific was very different. The training grounds at Camp Pendleton could never mirror the real conditions of Guadalcanal's humidity or Iwo Jima's volcanic ash. Paper targets never returned fire, and engagements rarely happened at the close ranges Marines had practiced for. Much like bayonet drills and gas defense training, both of which prepared men for threats that barely occurred in World War II, shotgun training ended up preparing Marines for scenarios that seldom developed in the field. Another major limitation came from logistics. Each 12-gauge shell was nearly twice as heavy as a rifle cartridge and took up about 3 times the space. A Marine could carry 80 rounds of rifle ammo in the same weight and space it took to carry only 36 shotgun shells. With limited room on supply ships and landing craft, commanders prioritized rifle ammunition, machine gun belts, and mortar rounds. That left shotgun shells low on the list, which meant frontline troops often received only a box or two of shells to last an entire operation. Scarcity discouraged widespread use, keeping the weapon's actual impact far below its potential. Before the battles for Manila and Naha, planners believed shotguns would shine in city fighting. Close quarters, short distances, and room clearing seemed ideal for the weapon. But combat inside these cities didn't match the expectation. Japanese defenders built overlapping kill zones, used barricades, booby traps, and fields of fire that forced Americans to fight at distances where shotguns were useless. Even when fighting did reach close quarters, Marines overwhelmingly turned to grenades, Thompson submachine guns, and flamethrowers. The Thompson's 30-round magazine gave it a huge advantage over a shotgun's 6-round tube, especially in sustained firefights. While the shotgun never changed Japanese tactics, it still carved out a strong place in American cultural memory. The image of Marines storming bunkers with trench guns became an icon, even though it had little foundation in the historical record. This fit into a broader American story, a practical, no-nonsense military using tools borrowed from hunting and everyday life. In truth, the weapon's limited use came more from combat conditions than from cultural blind spots. Japanese forces focused on rifles, artillery, and machine guns, while shotguns barely appeared in their assessments of American firepower. The broader lesson is about how weapons and doctrine connect. Shotguns worked exactly as designed, devastating at close range, but they needed very specific conditions to be effective. Those conditions rarely appeared in the Pacific Campaign. Unlike the bar, which became the backbone of squad firepower, or the flamethrower, which transformed bunker-clearing tactics, shotguns never drove any major shift in doctrine. Administrative records support this. Rifles and machine guns constantly needed repairs and replacement parts due to heavy battlefield use. Shotguns, on the other hand, mostly required maintenance from rust and storage damage rather than combat wear. Ammunition requests tell the same story. Millions of rifle rounds and hundreds of thousands of machine gun rounds were ordered for each campaign, but shotgun shells were requested in much smaller numbers, mostly for training purposes. Looking at other nations confirms this limited role. British and Australian troops in the Pacific carried very few shotguns, relying instead on rifles and submachine guns, yet fought effectively in jungle conditions. The Soviets, despite producing enormous amounts of small arms for every kind of battle, never fielded combat shotguns. Chinese forces, fighting brutal close-range battles with Japan, also didn't use them, even though they desperately needed effective weapons. All of this shows that shotguns were a tactical option, not an essential one. After the war, military analysts studied which weapons should be carried into future conflicts. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, and new recoilless rifles all received investment and refinement. Shotguns received little attention, since their World War II performance hadn't justified further development. Even in the Korean War, which featured plenty of close-range fighting, shotguns saw only limited use. The record makes it clear. Shotguns were present, occasionally useful, and remembered fondly in certain situations. But they were never decisive, never central, and their real contribution was far smaller than the myths that came after the war. In Korea, Marines went on patrol carrying M1 Garands, bars, and carbines, not shotguns. This was no accident. Many of these men were veterans of the Pacific War, and their choices reflected hard combat experience. They knew the difference between a weapon that looked good in theory and one that actually worked in the field. It wasn't until Vietnam that the shotgun reappeared in noticeable numbers. Modified commercial models saw use in jungle patrols. Even then, the shotgun was not a standard-issue arm. It was a niche tool, mostly for point men cutting trails or tunnel rats crawling underground. That same pattern continues today. Shotguns remain part of military arsenals, but they are specialized tools rather than frontline combat weapons. The history of Japanese encounters with American shotguns during World War II points to several clear conclusions. First, while shotguns were officially issued to Marine units throughout the Pacific, their actual combat use was limited. Problems with ammunition, restrictions in tactics, and a lack of doctrinal support held them back. The introduction of brass case shells in March 1945 solved the moisture issue, but it came too late to influence major battles. Second, Japanese forces never developed countermeasures against shotguns. The reason was simple: they didn't have to. Shotguns never reached a level of effectiveness that required special attention. Japanese military records, training manuals, and post-war studies are full of detailed responses to American artillery, naval gunfire, tanks, and aircraft. Shotguns are almost entirely absent, which shows how little they mattered in shaping battle outcomes. Third, the gap between the number of authorized shotguns and how many were actually used in combat was wide. On paper, each Marine division was supposed to have 306 shotguns. In practice, most ended up in guard posts, training ranges, or rear security. Veterans who did carry them often described the guns as handy for specific jobs, but not weapons they wanted to rely on once a firefight began. Fourth, the legend of the shotgun in the Pacific far exceeds the reality. Popular culture has portrayed it as an iconic weapon of the war, but the evidence does not support that reputation. Movies, novels, and video games helped build an image of Marines storming caves with trench guns. The actual war was determined by rifles, bars, machine guns, mortars, artillery, flamethrowers, and naval firepower. The shotgun's role was much smaller and far less decisive. This disconnect offers a broader lesson. Just because a weapon is technically capable doesn't mean it will change the battlefield. For real impact, a weapon has to fit into doctrine, logistics, and training. Shotguns had potential, but they never overcame the limits of supply problems, tactical conditions, and doctrinal neglect. The Japanese never feared them because they never needed to. Their focus on the weapons that actually threatened them, artillery, bombs, tanks, and flamethrowers, was correct. America's ability to mass-produce thousands of shotguns during the war showed industrial strength, but production numbers didn't automatically translate into combat power. Making weapons in factories is one thing. Employing them effectively under battlefield conditions is another. The Pacific Campaign demonstrated that industrial might only matters when matched with effective tactics and logistics. The story of Japanese infantry facing American shotguns reveals more about myth-making than it does about combat effectiveness. Shotguns were present, yes. They were occasionally useful, yes. But they were not decisive, not widespread, and not a weapon that shaped campaigns. The fact that Japanese forces were surprised to encounter them mattered little, because the shotgun never played a large enough role to change outcomes. The official record, production tables, training documents, and unit organization charts confirms that Marines had shotguns, but the absence of detailed combat reports, statistical data, and Japanese counter-strategies confirms that their real employment was limited. Veterans who carried them often recall the shotgun as a helpful but situational tool. By contrast, they remembered rifles and automatic weapons as the backbone of survival in battle. The brass ammunition introduced in March 1945 fixed the moisture issue that had plagued shotguns across the Pacific Islands. Yet by then, Iwo Jima was already secured, Okinawa was underway, and the war's decisive battles had been shaped by other weapons. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, might have seen more use of shotguns in city fighting, but the atomic bombs ended the war before that could happen. In modern times, military forces still use shotguns, but their roles are very specific: door breaching, firing less lethal rounds, and close quarters use in limited conditions. These roles today more closely reflect how shotguns were actually used in World War II than the myths created after the fact. The transformation of limited history into powerful cultural imagery shows how military stories evolve. The sight of a Marine with a shotgun blasting into a bunker fits the need for drama, even if it doesn't match the verified record. The myth has become part of the larger story of American adaptability and improvisation in war. But when we strip away the layers of exaggeration, what remains is a more practical truth. Shotguns were issued, carried, and occasionally fired, but they never came close to deciding the outcome of battles in the Pacific. Japanese infantry may not have expected to face 12-gauge American shotguns, but their surprise didn't matter. What defeated them was not buckshot, but overwhelming American firepower, logistics, and combined arms tactics. The shotgun story, properly understood, is less about battlefield dominance and more about the way history and culture reshape memory.